When the Nazi regime rose to power in Nazi Germany, it quickly began constructing a vast system of imprisonment designed to silence opposition and control society through fear. The first camps appeared shortly after Adolf Hitler became chancellor in 1933. At the beginning, these early detention sites were mainly used to imprison political opponents of the regime. Communists, socialists, journalists, trade union leaders, and other critics of the new government were arrested and sent to camps without trial. One of the earliest and most infamous camps was Dachau concentration camp, which soon became a model for many others that followed. Guarded by armed SS units, Dachau established the brutal structure that would later define the entire concentration camp system. Inside these early camps, prisoners lived under constant threat of violence. They were forced into exhausting labor, deprived of basic necessities, and subjected to harsh punishments for the smallest infractions. The camps were not only places of detention, they were instruments of terror meant to intimidate the German population and eliminate dissent. As the Nazi regime tightened its grip on power, the number of prisoners expanded dramatically. What began as a tool for suppressing political enemies soon grew into a much larger system of persecution. The Nazis began targeting groups they considered undesirable, including Jews, Roma, disabled individuals, homosexuals, religious minorities, and many others. By the late 1930s, the network of camps had grown far beyond its original purpose. Facilities were built across Germany and later throughout territories occupied by the Nazi regime. Each camp served different functions. Some were forced labor camps, others transit camps where prisoners were held temporarily, and some were sites of extreme punishment and brutal discipline. When World War II began, the scale of the camp system expanded even further. Nazi authorities created thousands of additional detention sites across Europe. Entire populations were uprooted, deported, and imprisoned as German forces occupied new territories. During the war, the camps became central to the Nazi system of exploitation and persecution. Prisoners were forced to work in factories, mines, construction projects, and military industries under brutal conditions. Many died of exhaustion, disease, starvation, or systematic abuse. But the camp system would soon take on an even darker role. As Nazi racial ideology became more radical and violent, certain camps were transformed into places designed specifically for mass murder. These extermination centers would become the core of what is now known as the Holocaust. Despite the suffering and terror within these camps, the system continued to grow until the final years of the war. It was only when Allied forces advanced into German territory in 1944 and 1945 that the world began to see the full extent of the atrocities committed inside them. The liberation of the camps revealed a network of imprisonment and destruction far larger than anyone had imagined, thousands of locations where millions had suffered and where countless lives had been lost. Today, many of these sites remain as memorials and historical institutions. They stand as reminders of the consequences of hatred, authoritarianism, and unchecked power, ensuring that the stories of those who endured these camps are not forgotten. Between 1933 and 1945, the regime of Nazi Germany built one of the largest systems of imprisonment in modern history. Across Germany and throughout territories occupied during World War II, tens of thousands of detention sites were created. Many of these places were simply called camps, but in reality they belonged to several different systems, each designed for a specific purpose. As the Nazi state expanded its control across Europe, the network of camps became increasingly complex. Different authorities, including the SS, the German military, local police, and even collaborating governments, managed various types of detention centers. Each type of camp served a particular role in the machinery of repression, exploitation, and mass murder that defined the regime. Earliest camps appeared soon after the Nazis came to power in 1933. These early detention centers were primarily used to imprison political opponents, members of opposition parties, journalists, activists, and critics of the regime were arrested and held without trial. Many of these early camps were improvised in abandoned factories, military bases, or prisons before the larger concentration camp system was fully established. Over time, the Nazi government expanded the system into what became known as concentration camps. These camps were administered primarily by the SS and were designed to imprison individuals whom the regime considered enemies or undesirable. Prisoners included Jews, political dissidents, Roma, religious minorities, homosexuals, and others targeted by Nazi ideology. Life in these camps was marked by forced labor, starvation, violence, and extreme punishment. Another type of camp created by the Nazis targeted specific ethnic groups. Special facilities known as Zigeunerlager, or gypsy camps, were established to imprison Roma and Sinti communities. Entire families were often detained together in these camps under brutal conditions, and many prisoners were later deported to extermination centers. Forced labor camps formed another crucial part of the Nazi system. As Germany's war economy demanded increasing amounts of labor, millions of prisoners were forced to work in factories, mines, construction projects, and agricultural operations. Prisoners were often subjected to exhausting labor under harsh conditions, with little food, inadequate shelter, and constant surveillance by armed guards. Many died from exhaustion, disease, or abuse. The Nazis also operated camps for prisoners of war, especially after German forces captured millions of soldiers during military campaigns across Europe and the Soviet Union. While some prisoners were held in accordance with international conventions, many, particularly Soviet prisoners, were subjected to brutal treatment, starvation, and mass death. Transit camps and collection camps formed another layer of the detention system. These sites functioned as temporary holding centers where prisoners, particularly Jews, were gathered before being deported elsewhere. From these camps, large numbers of people were transported by train to labor camps, concentration camps, or extermination camps. The most horrific category of camps were the extermination camps, which were created specifically for systematic mass murder. In these camps, the vast majority of prisoners were killed shortly after arrival, often in gas chambers designed to murder large numbers of people in a short time. Beyond these main categories, the Nazi regime maintained many other forms of detention. Ghettos were established in cities across occupied Eastern Europe where Jewish populations were forced to live under overcrowded and desperate conditions. Secret police prisons run by the Gestapo held individuals accused of resistance or dissent. Youth detention centers, regular prisons, and facilities aimed at the forced Germanization of certain prisoners were also part of the broader system. Mass killing occurred in locations that were not traditional camps. One example was the program known as the T4 euthanasia program, where the Nazi state murdered individuals with physical or mental disabilities in specialized killing centers. These sites became early testing grounds for methods of mass murder later used in extermination camps. In addition to camps directly run by German authorities, several allied or collaborating governments established their own detention systems. In territories such as Transnistria, Hungarian-controlled regions, Croatia, and Slovakia, local regimes created ghettos, internment camps, and other facilities where Jews and other targeted groups were imprisoned. Taken together, these thousands of locations formed a vast network of control, exploitation, and destruction. While each type of camp served a different function, they all were connected to the broader goals of the Nazi regime:
persecution, domination, and ultimately the elimination of entire groups of people.
In January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Almost immediately, the Nazi regime began building a system of detention designed to silence its political enemies and consolidate power. These first camps were not yet part of the later, highly organized concentration camp network. Instead, they emerged quickly and often chaotically as part of a campaign of political terror. Local authorities, police units, and Nazi paramilitary groups established detention centers across the country to imprison individuals suspected of opposing the regime. The arrests began within weeks of the Nazi takeover. Thousands of people were detained without trial, often simply because they belonged to organizations that opposed the Nazi Party. Members of the German Communist Party, socialist activists, trade unionists, journalists, and political organizers were among the first targets. Most of the prisoners held in these early camps were young men who had been active in left-wing political movements. In many cases, they had committed no crime. Their detention was based purely on political suspicion and the desire of the regime to eliminate potential resistance. By the end of 1933, tens of thousands of prisoners had passed through these early camps. The facilities themselves were often improvised. Many were established inside abandoned factories, former military barracks, warehouses, or prisons. Others were set up in rural areas where prisoners could be isolated from the public. Historians estimate that at least 100 early detention camps operated throughout Germany during this period. However, these camps were not uniform in structure or administration. Each one functioned differently depending on who controlled it. Some were managed by local police authorities, while others were run directly by Nazi paramilitary groups such as the SA, Sturmabteilung, or early SS units. Because there was no centralized system yet in place, conditions varied widely from one camp to another. Despite these differences, many camps shared similar characteristics. Prisoners were subjected to beatings, humiliation, and forced labor. Guards often used violence as a method of intimidation, seeking to break the morale of detainees and demonstrate the absolute authority of the new regime. Several of the early camps became particularly well known. Among them were Esterwagen and Bergermoor, which were located in the remote moorlands of northern Germany. Prisoners in these camps were forced to perform exhausting labor, draining swamps, and preparing land for agricultural use. Another early facility operated in Oranienburg, near Berlin. Like many of the first camps, it held large numbers of political prisoners and was used as a tool of intimidation against those suspected of resisting Nazi rule. Berlin itself, the Columbia House detention center functioned as an early concentration camp where prisoners were interrogated, abused, and held under harsh conditions. The camp became infamous for the brutality of its guards. Other camps existed in places like Heinewalde and Heineken, illustrating how widespread these early detention centers had become during the first year of Nazi rule. However, most of these early camps did not operate for long periods. As the Nazi regime strengthened its control over Germany, the government began reorganizing the detention system. Authorities sought to standardize the camps and place them under a more centralized command structure. Gradually, many of the improvised facilities were closed. Others were consolidated into a smaller number of larger, more permanent camps that would eventually become the official concentration camp system administered by the SS. During this transition, a significant number of prisoners were released. By late 1933 and 1934, the Nazi regime believed it had largely crushed organized political opposition within Germany. Yet the closure of many early camps did not mark the end of the detention system. Instead, it marked the beginning of something far more structured and far more dangerous. The camps that replaced these early facilities would soon become central instruments of repression, forced labor, and persecution across Nazi-controlled Europe.
What had begun as a temporary wave of political terror was now evolving into a permanent system, one that would expand dramatically in the years leading to World War II and eventually play a central role in the genocide known as the Holocaust.
As the Nazi regime strengthened its control over Germany during the 1930s, the improvised detention camps of the early years gradually evolved into a more structured and centralized system. These facilities became known as concentration camps, a specific category of detention centers that played a central role in the machinery of repression created by Nazi Germany. The concentration camps were administered by the Schutzstaffel, commonly known as the SS. This powerful paramilitary organization gradually took control over the entire concentration camp system, transforming it into a disciplined and highly organized network of imprisonment. In the early years of Nazi rule, these camps were primarily used as instruments of political terror. The regime used them to intimidate and silence individuals who opposed the Nazi government. Political activists, journalists, members of left-wing parties, trade union leaders, and critics of the regime were among the first prisoners held within the concentration camps. However, as the ideology of the Nazi state became more radical and aggressive, the categories of prisoners expanded significantly. The camps began to hold individuals whom the regime labeled as enemies of the state or undesirable elements. These included Jews, Roma and Sinti communities, religious minorities, homosexuals, and individuals accused of violating social norms defined by Nazi ideology. Inside the camps, prisoners lived under strict and brutal discipline. The SS imposed a rigid system of control designed to strip prisoners of their identity and dignity. Prisoners were forced to wear uniforms marked with colored symbols that identified the category to which they had been assigned. Daily life in the camps was extremely harsh. Prisoners were subjected to exhausting routines that included roll calls lasting for hours, limited food rations, overcrowded barracks, and constant surveillance by armed guards. Punishments for even minor infractions could be severe and often involved beatings, solitary confinement, or other forms of physical abuse. Forced labor quickly became one of the central features of the concentration camp system. The SS began exploiting prisoners as a source of cheap labor for a variety of projects. Prisoners were forced to work in construction, quarrying, road building, agriculture, and later in factories connected to Germany's expanding war economy. Conditions during forced labor were extremely dangerous. Prisoners were expected to perform physically demanding work while suffering from hunger, illness, and exhaustion. Many prisoners died from overwork, disease, or mistreatment. One of the earliest and most influential concentration camps was Dachau concentration camp, which became a model for the organization and administration of other camps. Over time, additional camps were established across Germany and later throughout territories occupied by the Nazi regime. By the late 1930s, concentration camps had become an integral part of the Nazi system of control. They were no longer temporary detention centers, but permanent institutions used to imprison, punish, and exploit large numbers of people. When World War II began in 1939, the role of concentration camps expanded dramatically. The number of prisoners increased, and new camps were constructed throughout occupied Europe. Although concentration camps were not originally designed as extermination facilities, the brutal conditions within them resulted in countless prisoners' deaths. Starvation, disease, violence, and forced labor claimed thousands of lives, even before the system evolved into a larger mechanism of genocide. As the war progressed and Nazi policies became increasingly radical, the concentration camp system would become closely linked to one of the most devastating crimes in human history, the Holocaust. The camps that began as tools of political repression were now part of a vast network of persecution and exploitation that stretched across Europe. As the Nazi regime consolidated power during the 1930s,
the system of concentration camps became increasingly structured and centralized. The first official concentration camp operated by the SS was Dachau concentration camp, which opened in March 1933. Dachau quickly became the model for the entire concentration camp system. Its administrative structure, disciplinary methods, and system of prisoner control were studied and replicated across other camps. The SS developed strict procedures for surveillance, punishment, forced labor, and the classification of prisoners. Over time, these practices would shape the organization of camps throughout Nazi-controlled Europe. Before the outbreak of World War II, the Nazi regime had already begun expanding the concentration camp network within Germany and newly annexed territories. Several major camps were established during the late 1930s as the system grew larger and more permanent. Among the most important of these camps was Sachsenhausen concentration camp, which opened in March 1933 and served as a major administrative center for the concentration camp system. The camp became a training site for SS officers and played an important role in organizing the broader network of camps. Another major facility was Buchenwald concentration camp, established in 1937. Located near the city of Weimar, Buchenwald held prisoners from across Europe and eventually became one of the largest concentration camps within the Nazi system. Additional camps were constructed as the regime expanded its control. These included Flossenburg concentration camp, which was closely linked to forced labor in nearby quarries, and Ravensbrück concentration camp, which was primarily used to imprison female prisoners. After Germany annexed Austria in 1938, another major camp was established at Mauthausen concentration camp. Mauthausen became notorious for its brutal forced labor conditions, especially in the nearby granite quarries, where prisoners were forced to carry heavy stone blocks up steep stairways under constant guard. When the Second World War began in 1939, the concentration camp system expanded dramatically. As German armies occupied large areas of Europe, new camps were constructed to control and exploit the growing number of prisoners captured or deported from occupied territories. Among the new camps established during the war were Neuengamme concentration camp, Gross-Rosen concentration camp, and Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. The Nazis also created several major camps in occupied Poland, which became central locations in the camp system. One of these was Stuvhof concentration camp, which initially held Polish political prisoners but later imprisoned people from across Europe. Another important site was Majdanek concentration camp, also known as Lublin Majdanek. This camp served both as a concentration camp and as a location where mass killings took place. Perhaps the most infamous camp of all was Auschwitz concentration camp. Over time, Auschwitz expanded into a vast complex of camps that included Auschwitz II-Birkenau, where hundreds of thousands of people were murdered as part of the genocide known as the Holocaust. Concentration camps were not limited to Germany and Poland. They were also established in other territories under German control. For example, the camp of Herzogenbusch concentration camp operated in the Netherlands, while Natzweiler-Struthhof concentration camp functioned in occupied France. By the later years of the war, the concentration camp system had grown into a massive network of camps and subcamps spread across Europe. These camps imprisoned individuals from dozens of countries and ethnic backgrounds. Historians estimate that more than 2 million people were imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps during the period of Nazi rule. Within these camps, hundreds of thousands died as a result of starvation, disease, forced labor, violence, and execution. The concentration camp system had evolved from a tool of political repression into a vast machinery of exploitation and destruction that extended across the continent.
Beginning in the mid-1930s, The Nazi regime expanded its system of persecution to include another targeted group within Europe, the Roma and Sinti peoples. Under the racial ideology of Nazi Germany, these communities were labeled as racially inferior and dangerous to the so-called purity of German society. Starting around 1935, German authorities began establishing special detention areas known as Zigeunerlager, a German term that literally meant gypsy camps. These camps were designed to isolate and control Roma and Sinti populations living in Germany and in territories that had been annexed by the Nazi regime. Unlike many concentration camps that were directly organized by central authorities, the creation of Zigeunerlager often began as local initiatives. Municipal governments, local police departments, and regional administrative authorities played a significant role in establishing these camps. As a result, they appeared in many towns and cities throughout Germany. Most of these camps were located on the outskirts of urban areas or near small towns. Their purpose was to remove Roma and Sinti families from regular communities and place them under constant surveillance. In many cases, entire families, including children and elderly individuals, were forced to relocate to these sites. Life inside the Zigeunerlager was harsh and heavily restricted. Residents were subjected to strict curfews that limited their movement. Police and local authorities closely monitored the camps, ensuring that those inside could not easily leave. Sanitary conditions were often extremely poor, with overcrowded living spaces, limited access to clean water, and inadequate medical care. Although not every Roma or Sinti individual in Germany was forced into these camps, a large number were eventually relocated to them as part of the regime's broader policies of racial segregation and persecution. Among the most well-known Zigeunerlager established in Nazi Germany was the camp at Berlin-Marzahn, located on the outskirts of the German capital. This camp was created shortly before the 1936 Berlin Olympic Games, when Nazi authorities sought to remove Roma and Sinti people from public view in the city. Another significant camp was established at Lachenbach, which later became one of the main detention sites for Roma populations within territories controlled by the Nazi regime. Similarly, a Zigeunerlager operated at Köln-Bickendorf, where Roma families were confined under police supervision. As World War II began and Germany expanded its occupation across Europe, the fate of many Roma and Sinti prisoners worsened dramatically. Nazi authorities began deporting large numbers of individuals from these camps in Germany to territories in Eastern Europe that had fallen under German control. In these occupied regions, many Roma and Sinti people were subjected to mass shootings, forced labor, starvation, and other forms of systematic violence. Entire communities were destroyed as part of the broader campaign of racial persecution carried out by the Nazi regime. Some Roma and Sinti prisoners were deported to the concentration camp complex of Auschwitz concentration camp, where a special section of the camp was created for them. This section was commonly known as the Gypsy Family Camp. Located within Auschwitz II-Birkenau, the area was officially designated as Section B2E. Unlike other parts of the camp, where prisoners were immediately separated, Roma families were initially kept together in this section. Roma prisoners arrived at Auschwitz after being deported from several countries across Central and Western Europe. Conditions in the camp were extremely severe. Prisoners suffered from overcrowding, disease, malnutrition, and forced labor. Over time, many of those held in the Roma section of Auschwitz were murdered or died due to the brutal conditions imposed upon them. The persecution of Roma and Sinti communities became a tragic aspect of the genocide known as the Holocaust. The existence of the Zigeunerlager demonstrates how the Nazi system of camps was not limited to political prisoners or Jews alone. Instead, it targeted multiple groups across Europe, all of whom were subjected to persecution based on racial ideology and discriminatory policies.
During World War II, the Nazi regime developed one of the largest systems of forced labor in modern history, Millions of people across Europe were compelled to work under brutal conditions in factories, farms, construction sites, and industrial complexes controlled by Nazi Germany. This vast network of forced labor camps became essential to the German war economy. As the war expanded and more German men were sent to the front lines, the Nazi regime faced a growing shortage of workers. To solve this problem, authorities began deporting civilians and prisoners from occupied territories and forcing them into labor. Within these camps, prisoners worked long hours under extremely harsh conditions. Food was scarce, living quarters were overcrowded, and medical care was almost non-existent. Workers were expected to perform physically exhausting labor despite malnutrition, illness, and constant surveillance by guards. Many prisoners died from exhaustion, starvation, disease, or abuse. Both the Nazi government and private German companies benefited from this system. Prisoners were forced to work in industries that supported the war effort, including weapons manufacturing, mining, transportation infrastructure, and military construction projects. In many cases, large industrial firms relied heavily on forced labor to maintain production during the later years of the war. Several different types of forced labor camps existed within the Nazi system. One major category consisted of camps that held foreign civilians deported to Germany from occupied countries. These individuals were often taken from places such as Poland and the Soviet Union and transported to Germany, where they were forced to perform manual labor for the war effort. These foreign laborers were used in agriculture, factories, construction, and other sectors of the economy. Although conditions varied, many workers faced severe restrictions on movement and were subjected to harsh discipline. Their lives were tightly controlled by the authorities responsible for managing labor assignments. Another type of camp was known as Arbeitserziehungslager, or labor education camps. These facilities were administered by the Gestapo, the secret police of Nazi Germany. Officially, these camps were intended to punish workers accused of violating labor regulations. In reality, they served as brutal detention centers for individuals accused of sabotage, attempting to escape forced labor, or refusing to work. Prisoners sent to these camps were often subjected to harsh discipline and extremely demanding labor as a form of punishment and intimidation. One example of such a facility was the camp at Sirets, located in occupied Ukraine. Prisoners in camps like Sirets were often forced to work under extremely dangerous conditions, and survival rates were low due to starvation, violence, and disease. Another important category consisted of forced labor camps created specifically for Jewish prisoners in territories occupied by Germany in Eastern Europe. Many of these camps were located in regions such as Upper Silesia, an area that is today part of Poland. These camps were frequently connected to industrial operations where prisoners were forced to perform heavy labor. Among the most well-known forced labor camps in this region were Blechhammer, Janowska, Plaszow, Skodzisko-Kamienna, Pionki, Starachowice, and Częstochowa. In these camps, prisoners endured extremely harsh working conditions while producing materials or performing tasks that supported the German war effort. Although forced labor camps and concentration camps had different administrative structures, they often shared similar conditions. Both types of camps relied on forced labor and harsh discipline. Prisoners were exploited economically while being subjected to severe restrictions and constant surveillance. However, there were also important differences between them. Concentration camps were usually standardized institutions run by centralized SS authorities. Prisoners in these camps were typically registered, assigned identification numbers, and forced to wear specific uniforms that identified them within the camp system. Forced labor camps, on the other hand, were often administered by a variety of authorities, including local police, industrial organizations, or regional administrative offices. Because of this, they were not always organized in the same standardized way as concentration camps. In many cases, prisoners in forced labor camps did not wear uniforms and were not assigned identification numbers in the same manner.
As the war progressed and the Nazi system became increasingly desperate for labor, the distinction between these different types of camps began to fade. Some forced labor camps were eventually absorbed into the concentration camp system. One example was Blechhammer, which was later incorporated as a subcamp of Auschwitz concentration camp in 1944. This change reflected how the entire camp network was becoming more centralized as the war entered its final stages. The forced labor system demonstrated how the Nazi regime combined ideological persecution with economic exploitation. Millions of people across Europe were forced to work under brutal conditions in order to sustain the German war machine. These camps became another tragic component of the broader genocide known as the Holocaust, in which countless individuals were persecuted, exploited, and ultimately killed.
During World War II, Nazi authorities created additional types of detention centers designed specifically to facilitate the deportation of Jewish populations across Europe. These facilities were known as transit camps and collection camps, and they played a crucial role in the implementation of the genocide known as the Holocaust. Transit camps, known in German as Durchgangslager, and collection camps, known as Sammellager, were used as temporary detention centers where Jewish men, women, and children were held before being deported to other locations. These camps were often the final stop in a person's home country before they were transported deeper into the Nazi camp system. These facilities were closely linked to the Nazi policy known as the final solution to the Jewish question. This policy represented the systematic plan created by Nazi Germany to eliminate Jewish communities across Europe. Under this plan, Jewish families were first forced to leave their homes. They were often ordered to gather at specific locations where they were arrested and transported to detention centers. From there, they were deported, most commonly by train, to ghettos, forced labor camps, concentration camps, or extermination centers located in occupied territories in Eastern Europe. For many Jews living in Western and Central Europe, transit camps functioned as an intermediate stage in this process. After being expelled from their homes, they were taken to these camps where they waited, sometimes for several days, sometimes longer, before being deported again. For thousands of individuals, these camps became the final place they saw in their home country. Entire communities passed through these locations as deportations intensified during the later years of the war. Several major transit camps became central points in the deportation system. One of the most significant was Westerbork Transit Camp, located in the Netherlands. From this camp, thousands of Jewish prisoners were deported by train to camps in occupied Poland. Another important transit center was Drancy internment camp in France. Drancy served as the primary gathering point for Jews arrested in France before being deported eastward. In Belgium, a similar function was carried out by the transit camp at Mechelen Transit Camp, where large numbers of prisoners were held before deportation. In the territory of occupied Czechoslovakia, the Theresienstadt ghetto also functioned as a major transit location. From there, many Jewish prisoners were transported to camps in the east. Collection camps operated in a similar way, but were often located within cities themselves. These sites were used to gather Jewish populations before deportation. For example, several collection camps were established in Vienna, including those located in Kleine Sperlgasse, Castellesgasse, and Malzgasse. In Berlin, another collection center operated at Große Hamburger Straße, where Jewish residents were detained before being deported to other locations within the Nazi system. While transit and collection camps were used to organize deportations, another category of camps existed with an even more deadly purpose. These were the extermination centers, often referred to as death camps. Unlike concentration camps or forced labor camps, extermination centers were created specifically to carry out mass murder on an industrial scale. The primary method of killing used in these camps involved poisonous gas released inside sealed gas chambers. Victims were often transported directly from transit camps to these extermination centers. Upon arrival, many prisoners were sent to gas chambers shortly after reaching the camp. 5 main extermination centers were established as part of the Nazi program of mass murder. These were Chelmno Extermination Camp, Belzec Extermination Camp, Sobibor Extermination Camp, Treblinka Extermination Camp, and Auschwitz II-Birkenau. These facilities were constructed primarily between 1941 and 1942 and were designed with the single objective of killing large numbers of people as efficiently as possible. Historians estimate that approximately 2.7 million Jews were murdered in these 5 extermination centers alone. This number represents nearly half of all Jewish victims killed during the Holocaust. In total, Nazi Germany, along with its allies and collaborators across Europe, murdered around 6 million Jewish men, women, and children during the Holocaust. The transit camps, collection camps, and extermination centers formed interconnected parts of a vast system that enabled this unprecedented act of genocide. Today, the sites of many of these camps remain important historical locations. They serve as places of remembrance and education, ensuring that the events of the Holocaust are not forgotten. By the final months of World War II, the vast system of Nazi camps was beginning to collapse as Allied forces advanced from both the West and the East toward the heart of Nazi Germany. For years, millions of prisoners had endured brutal conditions inside concentration camps, forced labor camps, transit camps, and extermination centers. As the German military situation deteriorated in 1944 and early 1945, Nazi authorities attempted to hide the evidence of their crimes while continuing to move prisoners across Europe. In many cases, camp officials forced prisoners to evacuate as Allied armies approached. These evacuations often took the form of long and deadly marches across freezing winter landscapes. Prisoners were forced to walk for days with little food or shelter, guarded by armed SS units. Many died along the way from exhaustion, starvation, illness, or execution if they could no longer continue. These forced evacuations later became known as death marches, one of the final tragedies of the camp system. Despite these efforts to conceal the camps, Allied forces soon began discovering them one by one as they advanced into German-controlled territory. What they found shocked soldiers, journalists, and the entire world. In January 1945, Soviet troops advancing through occupied Poland reached the complex of Auschwitz concentration camp. There they discovered thousands of survivors who had been left behind when the SS evacuated most prisoners shortly before the arrival of the Red Army. Inside the camp, soldiers encountered starving prisoners, abandoned barracks, and vast quantities of personal belongings taken from victims. The discovery revealed the scale of the atrocities committed within the Nazi camp system. As Allied forces continued their advance across Germany, more camps were liberated. In April 1945, American troops liberated Buchenwald concentration camp, where thousands of prisoners had survived under horrific conditions. Shortly afterward, British forces entered Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. What they found was one of the most shocking scenes of the war. Tens of thousands of prisoners were suffering from starvation, disease, and extreme exhaustion. Thousands more had already died and remained unburied throughout the camp. Photographs and film footage taken during the liberation of Bergen-Belsen quickly spread across the world. These images revealed the devastating consequences of years of persecution, forced labor, and systematic violence. Across Europe, Allied forces liberated many other camps and subcamps that formed part of the vast Nazi detention network. Survivors emerged from these camps physically weakened, but finally free from the system that had imprisoned them. For many survivors, however, liberation was only the beginning of a long recovery.
Years of imprisonment had left them suffering from severe malnutrition, disease, trauma, and the loss of families and communities. The discovery of the camps also forced the international community to confront the scale of the crimes committed by the Nazi regime. Evidence gathered from liberated camps later played a crucial role in the Nuremberg trials, where leading Nazi officials were prosecuted for war crimes and crimes against humanity. With the defeat of Nazi Germany in May 1945, the entire system of camps was finally dismantled. The regime that had built this vast network of repression and genocide had collapsed. In the decades that followed, many former campsites were preserved as memorials in museums. Places such as Auschwitz, Dachau, and others now serve as important historical sites where visitors can learn about the events that took place there. Today, these locations stand as reminders of the consequences of hatred, racism, and authoritarian power. They also serve as places of remembrance for the millions of people who suffered and died within the Nazi camp system. Remembering these events is essential to understanding the history of the 20th century and to ensuring that such atrocities are never repeated.